So let's take a look and kind of start with the idea of what we can do with the virtual machine manager. So first of all, we have some options. We could create, I'll put it at the center here, a new virtual machine. That's kind of what we've been talking about here, right? The deployment of these virtual machines. So what does it take for us to be able to set that up? Well, one of the things we could do and need to do is have an actual virtual hard drive. So we could start with basically a blank VHD, and that blank VHD, of course, would have to be a part of making this new virtual machine to basically create a place for the operating system and everything else that's going to be used. Now, we could also use an existing virtual hard drive. Now remember, virtual hard drive is just something we can copy. It's as an existing file. We don't have to always make a new one. We could have one that's maybe got everything that we already need set up. And of course, that could go straight into being a new virtual machine. Or we could go through our templates that we talked about. The templates, of course, having all the profiles and everything else that we need. And that from that template, we could then create that new virtual machine. All right, there are other ways, of course, to be able to put these together. One of the things, of course, like I said, is we could take a physical machine and go through that P to V, the physical to virtual environment. That process, of course, would result in a new virtual machine. Now remember, all of these things we can do through the virtual machine manager as far as the options of what we're actually trying to do. All right, there might already be an existing Hyper-V virtual machine. And that virtual machine, let's say like the domain controller, might be one that we want to create a new version of. That process of making a new version of an existing one is what we would call cloning. And so we could, of course, take that and certainly move it over. It might be maybe something from a Zen server. Remember, that's another competitor's virtualization option. And they might have a virtual machine that they have that we are using. And from that point, of course, we would want to do another conversion to make that a new virtual machine as well. Don't forget, we can still manage Zen servers or ESX servers from the virtual machine manager, but like I said, it might be actually nice to set that up the way we want it to in ours. It could be a VMware virtual machine, and again, in that process, we would be doing, well, let's see, I guess just as I mentioned before, that'd be my virtual to virtual type of conversion. Now with any of those, remember, we could, prior to setting it up with any of these, still create a new template. Maybe not one that's already been, that we've already gone through the work of putting together. And with a new template, apply those profiles and settings and send that over, as a template in the process of creating our new virtual machine. All of these are methods that we can go through. And basically what we'd, hopefully you got out of this, is we're actually talking about sources of where we could be creating that virtual machine. And so that's why we're going to talk about some of the considerations for doing the physical to virtual, talk about some of the options for the virtual to virtual and some of the considerations. And of course, we already had the discussion, hopefully, about these components, what the template is. Remember that the template, again, was a creation of our OS profiles. It was maybe our application profiles, also the hardware profiles that we were talking about creating. So the template's really kind of a collection of all of these items that we use, putting it together, and using that as the guidelines for the automatic creation of a virtual machine without having to do it the hard way. The hard way is over here, starting with a blank virtual hard drive, doing your own install. You'd have to do your own install of the operating systems and all your own installs of applications. You'd have to create your own hardware configurations. And so, that's what we're trying to avoid by doing it once as a template, or maybe a few times with a couple of different templates, again, depending on the operating system and what we're deploying. But those are the sources we would use. And basically some of the processes we would go through, at least as an overview on how to deploy these. Now, I hopefully have already talked about the proposition of being able to create host groups, and that we can use that for a lot of our management purposes. And a host group, remember, is a collection of different hosts that we are managing. And one of the purposes of creating a host group could be for the placement of a new virtual machine. Now, as far as you as the administrator, and you're connected over here to the virtual machine manager, you might have just said, you know what, I need a new virtual machine. All right, so we would go out there and get the appropriate template, get the right operating systems, all of the things that we need, and we would send that as a job to our host group. Now, the purpose of one of the things we can do in a host group is let Virtual Machine Manager view the needs of that template, the needs of that virtual machine, and then look at the resource capabilities of all of the hosts that we have. As I said, maybe I have one that's at 40% utilization, maybe another one at 20% utilization, maybe another one's hovering around 80% utilization. And the idea is that, number one, you're going to ask the Virtual Machine Manager to, knowing how the hosts are actually set up, knowing what resources are left, you're going to ask it to do that smart placement. And so when we talk about the placement, one of the things we can do is also create rules about some of the decision criteria of, and you'll see that as we do a demonstration. But what you're going to see is you're going to see the Virtual Machine Manager basically display for you a chart. And that chart would list, let's call that host A, host B, host C. And that chart would list for you the different hosts that you have over there and start putting star recommendations by which would be the best fit. So maybe we're going to give B a 5-star rating and maybe C only gets 1 star. You might also be told that it basically, to use my own slang, that it won't work, that there might not be enough resources on that host to do the deployment. By the way, if there's not enough resources, you're not going to be able to do the deployment. It won't start. It'll warn you and tell you that it can't assign the resources that are needed. So even though it tells you by some of these options, you still, as the user, get to choose, or as the administrator, can click on whichever one that you want out of that list. But the idea is that if you wanted some automation, you could also forego this list and just let the Virtual Machine Manager deploy that virtual machine to where it thinks is the best fit. Now, again, these rules that you create, if you make any custom placement rules, they're going to be based on some custom properties that you are going to define for the virtual machines and for the hosts themselves. But the goal is to make sure that you have success in the deployment and smart placement helping you try to better utilize all of your resources. So we're going to take a look at all of the steps to create a virtual machine through the Virtual Machine Manager, and going further than we did before in our demonstrations, which just kind of showed you a couple of network card options. So what we're going to do is, starting on our console, go to the Virtual Machines and Services workspace, and then up here we have the option that says to create a virtual machine. So that's what we're going to do. You'll also notice the conversion options are up there as well. All right, so we're going to have to click Browse, and through Browse, this gives us the opportunity, if we can see everything here a little bit better, to basically look at some of the information we can use as a source for this new virtual machine if we wanted to. Whether existing blank disks that are ready for us to use, or maybe even using existing virtual machine settings. All right, I'm going to cancel that one out, and let me bring this tool up a little higher so we can see all the options at the bottom. So in this case, we're going to, on the select source anyway, choose to create the new virtual machine with a blank virtual hard disk, and then we'll click on Next. From here, we're on the identity of this virtual machine. In this case, we'll just call it the Virtual Machine Demo, and we'll click on Next. And now we're at the point where we're going to be working with the hardware settings. And from this part, we have a number of options. If we started just with compatibility, we are looking at some of the options here to choose the type of profile. And for cloud compatibility, of course, we're using Hyper-V, so we want to be able to use that. Under the processor part of it, right now it's set to 1 processor. We can certainly set it to 2 up to 4. We also have an option here that says to allow migration to a virtual machine host that has a different processor version. So we're trying to get rid of any potentials for conflicts. All right, so now that we have that set up, we're going to go to the memory. Under the memory options here, And remember, I'm changing them in this column. I'm not hitting the next button, which is going to move me through this configuration list. From here, we're going to go ahead and give them dynamic memory. And we're going to change the maximum to much less than what it is right now. Oops. Get my numbers lock turned on. We're going to give them just 4 gigs of memory, so 4096. And then under the, let's see, what else do we have? Video adapter, we can drop down to there. We're not using floppy drives or COM ports. As far as the this part of it is set up, we do have some options with the Microsoft Remote FX3D video adapter, where you may want to choose multiple monitors and change the resolution. We're just going to stick with the standard one that we have here. And let me continue on down to a couple other options. Now, you know, we haven't actually said that we're making it, well, we did. We said we're going to create a disk, but you can see that it's starting off with a 40 gig as a primary option. And but we do need to be able to talk outside of this option here. And that's where we're going to choose the network adapter. And if I wanted to, I could have this one connect to any existing networks that we've created. So I'll go ahead and choose the external network. Again, some other options, of course, with dynamically assigning the MAC address or the static MAC address that we could assign. We also have some of the port profiles that we kind of worked on in an existing option or existing demonstration. And again, enables MAC spoofing if we need to, enable optimizations on the virtual switches, just parts of our network settings that we've looked at. And then, let's see if we can scroll down just a little bit more here. You might also notice again too that we can add new hardware that we don't already see towards the top of what we're working with. Also, if we had created profiles, which we'll talk about later, we could have just dropped that profile in there and had most of these settings already set up for us. Now, we're going to take a look at the advanced option. On the advanced options, we're going to go to availability. And from here, availability, of course, is which ones you want. Basically, as it's telling you here, identify virtual machines that you want the virtual machine manager to keep on separate hosts for improved continuity of service. And if I had some availability sets, we could have chosen those properties, or we could create a new one. But again, that's a matter of trying to keep this device running as smoothly as we can, or we could put this into a host cluster, again, for high availability. And it's just, again, a matter of how important is this virtual machine going to be for your production that you might choose some of these options. Now, as we continue to look at some of the options as we're going through here, we have some CPU priority. The CPU priority is basically a priority when we're doing the allocation of the physical server's CPU resources, kind of giving us an idea of which importance any of the threads or commands coming from this virtual machine going through the physical processor would have over others. So again, we can change some of that. We can also reserve some percentage of the CPU cycles, in a way kind of guaranteeing a little bit better service if we wanted to. And then we also have memory weight, kind of the same concept as a priority when we're fighting or having all these virtual machines, these guests contending for the same physical hardware, that we can play with that as well to, if it's going to be a high priority system, that we can set that up to do what we want. All right, so we're not going to play with any more of the settings, but just to make sure you saw some of these options, we'll click on Next. And once we get to the Select Destination here, we have a couple of options here as far as where we want to place this virtual machine as far as the host. Now, of course, really there's not many options because we only have the one host that we're using right now. But I certainly, if I had multiple groups, I could have chosen those. But I'll keep it at all hosts because that's where our current host is at, is under the all hosts. We didn't move it into the classroom group. And of course, I could also, in creating this machine, just store it straight into the library if that's what I wanted to do. All right, let me click on Next. Now we're at the Select Host option. This is where we can take a look at some of the placement ratings as far as which host would be the best bet. If I had multiple hosts, like I've mentioned, we would have a star rating that would tell you. at least by having a star rating on our host, that means that it does have the resources to be able to handle this particular device, or virtual machine, I should say. So we'll click on Next again. All right, so now we're at the Configure Settings, and in this particular case, we have the virtual hard disk that's asking us where it's going to move to for the virtual machine files. This is one of the storage paths that we created in a previous demo. So we see where it's going to store this virtual machine from where we set it up, and then we'll click on Next again. And from here, of course, we have a few other options. Again, whether or not we want to automatically turn off the virtual machine if as a setting. Again, it's so the options, of course, are options for optimization. Or automatically it says turn on the virtual machine if it was running when the physical server stopped, so that we don't have to go and restart it manually. If we're doing a stop, what action do you want to save the state? To turn off the virtual machine, which is like pulling the plug, shut down the guest operating systems. So again, you just have some extra properties that you can choose to use. And we'll click Next here. And from here, we're going to look at the script that would have shown you the commands that you would have been using through the use of PowerShell. Sometimes it's not as easy to see unless you do a little word wrap so you can see the full length of the commands. Again, this is something you could just copy and paste into a text file if you wanted to. Make some modifications and use it as part of your way of scripting the creation. Now, we actually are not going to utilize this virtual machine. I just wanted you to see all the steps. So we're going to cancel it from here. And, of course, being told that we're going to lose all of our data, but that's okay. But those are the steps you'd go through to be able to create a virtual machine. Short, of course, of actually turning it on and then going through the process of installing an operating system.